As we read the pages of Scripture, we find many characters with whom we are very familiar. Moses, David, Jesus, Paul. In children's ministries, those are familiar answers to just about any question related to Bible characters. At times in the biblical record, we are introduced to more mysterious figures, figures with whom we are much less familiar. One of those less familiar characters and more mysterious characters would be Melchizedek. So one might be reading through the book of Hebrews and run across one of the various references to Melchizedek. So who was Melchizedek and why is he significant? Melchizedek is actually mentioned in 3 passages of Scripture: Genesis 14, Psalm 110, and then Hebrews chapters 5 through 7. The biblical record introduces us to the historical Melchizedek in Genesis 14. In Genesis 14, Abraham has rescued Lot from a coalition of Mesopotamian kings, and after Abram, who later is renamed Abraham, rescues Lot, the priest Melchizedek meets up with Abram. There we are introduced to Melchizedek, and he is stated to be the king of Salem, which is a shortened form for Jerusalem, and he is also described as the priest of God Most High. So Melchizedek is a believing king priest who was a contemporary of Abraham. Now there are some details in the passage that become important later on. The fact that Melchizedek blesses Abraham and that Abraham pays tithes to Melchizedek in the verses that follow indicate that Melchizedek is in a way greater than Abraham. And of course, in Judaism and the nation of Israel, Abraham is a very prominent and important character. In this interaction, we see that the greater gives the blessing and the lesser gives gifts to the greater. So it does again show us that Melchizedek is in a sense greater than Abraham, and that is important once we turn to the book of Hebrews. The next mention of Melchizedek is actually in Psalm 110. Psalm 110 is a very important messianic psalm. It has very clear messianic ramifications, and the concept of the Messiah is often associated, appropriately so, with the rule of the Messiah, the son of David. Here in Psalm 110, the bulk of the passage does stress the rule and the victory of the Messiah. However, verse 4 points us to the priesthood of the Messiah. Now, this is a concept that's not limited to Psalm 110, but it is not quite as pronounced as the rule of the Messiah. We do see in Zechariah chapter 6 that the Messiah would be a king who would be a priest as well. Here in Psalm 110, verse 4, we have this prophecy that the Lord has sworn and will not relent. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. So verse 4 stresses the priestly role of the Messiah. Now, the Messiah would have to be a different type of a priest. The priestly line of the Old Testament is actually the tribe of Levi. And Jesus, the Messiah, is actually from the tribe of Judah. So we have a little bit of a problem, and the resolution to that problem is that the Messiah is actually from a different order of priesthood. He is not a Levitical priest, he is actually a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Again, hearkening back to the king priest in Genesis chapter 14. The Messiah had to be a priest of a different type in order to serve as a legitimate priest. The book of Hebrews explains the prophecy of Psalm 110 and develops the analogy between the messianic priesthood of Jesus and the Melchizedekian priesthood. The author of Hebrews makes several references to the figure Melchizedek, quoting Psalm 110. In chapter 5, specifically in verses 6 and 10, we have reference to Melchizedek, and then there's a brief mention of him at the end of chapter 6 as well, stressing the eternality of the Melchizedekian priesthood of Jesus. The author of Hebrews develops this more fully in chapter 7, where we have several elements of this Melchizedekian priesthood of Jesus, the Messiah. In the first 3 verses of Hebrews 7, we have a stress on the eternal nature of the priesthood of Jesus. After reviewing the historical account of Genesis, the author of Hebrews draws the conclusion that Melchizedek is a timeless figure because there's nothing mentioned about his origin or his end. The author of Hebrews argues that he is a timeless figure, which points us to the eternal nature of Jesus's priesthood. Now, I don't think that the author of Hebrews is saying that Melchizedek is an eternal being, but he's pointing us to the timelessness of his priesthood. We are not given details about the beginning or end of his priesthood, and again, that foreshadows the eternal priesthood of Jesus. The point of the comparison is that from the standpoint of the biblical record, Melchizedek's priesthood is timeless, and again, that foreshadows the greater and ultimate priesthood of Jesus. In verses 4 through 10, the author of Hebrews argues that Melchizedek is greater than Abraham. Again, as we already noted in the historical record, that Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek, and Melchizedek blessed Abraham. Thus, Melchizedek is greater than Abraham. Furthermore, Melchizedek is greater than the descendant of Abraham, Levi. Now again, the Levitical priesthood is what we are introduced to in the nation of Israel. However, Jesus, because he's a Melchizedekian priest, is greater than the Levitical priest because Melchizedek is greater than Abraham, who is greater than Levi. So the author of Hebrews is arguing that Christ in his Melchizedekian priesthood is superior to the Levitical priests. Verses 11 through 19 introduce us to a new phase of the discussion and basically argue that Psalm 110 would not have to have prophesied about a Melchizedekian priest if the Levitical priesthood did not have deficiencies. The very fact that there is a prophecy of a new order of priesthood indicates that the Levitical priesthood was in some way deficient. The point is that the Messiah, who is a Melchizedekian priest, is superior to Levitical priests. Finally, the author of Hebrews argues that the Melchizedekian priesthood of Jesus is better because it is given by divine decree. The Levitical priests received their priesthood because of their heritage, because their father was a priest and it's a part of the family line. Jesus became a priest by divine oath. As Psalm 110 says, the Messiah would be a priest by divine decree and not by heritage. All these factors enable Jesus to serve as our perfect high priest. He's able to save to the uttermost and to make intercession for us. He has completed his sacrificial work on behalf of the believer, and no further offering is necessary. So Melchizedek is a historical king priest who serves as a type of the priesthood of Jesus Christ. Although Melchizedek is a mysterious figure in the biblical narrative, the priesthood of Melchizedek is very significant in pointing us toward the ultimate perfect and eternal priest, Jesus Christ.